This is Reimagining Higher Education, your go-to podcast with remarkable education leaders sharing personal stories from their experience in and around the sector, including reflection and hope for progress in the sector. With your host, Professor Judyth Sachs, former PVC Learning and Teaching at the University of Sydney, Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Provost at Macquarie University, and Special Advisor in Higher Education at KPMG, and now Chief Academic Officer at Studiosity. Welcome.
I wish to acknowledge that I am talking to you on Gadigal land of the Eora people, and I wish to acknowledge members past and present and emerging, and recognise the contribution they've made to cultural life, spiritual life, and general life in Australia over many millennia. So, and now let me introduce Professor Patricia Davidson, who arrived at University of Wollongong as Vice-Chancellor in, was it April 2021?
Yes.
What a time to arrive. And prior to that, you'd spent 7 years in the US at Johns Hopkins as Dean of Nursing, which I'm sure you've got lots of stories to tell about that. And prior to that, you were a professor at UTS and a director of Curtin. And you have come home to Wollongong because you are a graduate of Wollongong.
Yes, absolutely.
And I do remember when that was announced, people were delighted that you were coming home. So if I could start, before I ask you to show me your object, what was it like returning to Wollongong?
Well, look, firstly, a huge relief to return to Wollongong, not normal times. I had, the last 2020 in the US to 21 was a very challenging time in the pandemic, particularly in my role at Hopkins. And to come back and have 10 days of, quarantine, being in a tiny room with my husband and 10 suitcases, and then starting it and really having initially thinking, it's, this is going to be different. And then COVID, the reality of COVID hit, but, easy as everything, easier the second time. And, but, it's wonderful to be back in Australia. I still do miss so many parts of the US and my colleagues and friends, but it's wonderful to be back in Australia.
And the university where you were awarded 2 degrees was certainly thrilled to have you back. So
it's so wonderful to be here.
So look, I asked everybody to bring an object that helps us understand you as an educator and your life as an educator and a leader. So did you bring an object with you this morning?
I did. And it's my phone. And I could tell you a little bit, why that. I think it speaks to connectivity and information. Mm-hmm. And, it's made such a big difference to me as an educator is the internet, social media, connection. I'm, for an old girl, I'm very pro-technology. And, I just think this connectivity, connection, access is just so important for education.
And I mean, when you lose it or when you misplace it.
When you misplace it, that's the whole thing. That's the challenge. But it doesn't go very far from my side, Judith. So it's yeah.
So you've got 3 relationships in your life. Your husband, your children, and your phone.
Absolutely. Which is a bit of a, it's really interesting. So, people talk about choosing resorts and holiday destinations, and my husband knows no Wi-Fi, I will not be a happy camper. So maybe there's a medication for that. But I, just find just the access to information, the dialogue and exchange, just to be so much part of my life.
So, given that we started with your being a student at Wollongong, what was undergraduate student life like for you? Because I imagine as you started as a nurse, you actually had a different sort of education experience.
Well, look, I was one of those weird people that I was doing my nursing while I was doing my BA. So I've never been a full-time student. So I was always part-time. My youth, I started at ANU when I first left school, but I dropped out, for a whole range of reasons. And I came and started nursing at Wollongong, but I just also felt that I wanted to do something a little bit more. And, at that stage, nursing was a very sort of biomedically focused profession. So it was great to be able to do the social sciences at Wollongong, which I think, really sort of set my career and as a clinician and researcher and educator up. So I've never been a full-time student, so I can't really comment on, life in the uni bar and things like that, because, my life was very different, as it is probably for many students,
Yeah. So just tell me a bit what that life was like, because I also did 2 degrees at the one time, one at the University of Queensland and one at Teachers College. So yes.
Yeah. So what was it like? Look, I think, 2 very different cultures, and because I remember vividly, even when I went to Wollongong Hospital, because in those days nursing was in the hospitals. So I'd come from ANU, can you imagine, the late 70s, Vietnam War, lots of activity on campus. And my first assignment, I put my name on and I got my Christian name crossed out with SN, which stood for student nurse. So very different cultures. Can I tell you, the teachers at Wollongong at that time were amazing. Sometimes I say, actually, I've got a welcome to Wollongong event with students tonight. If they could go back to think that you would have your tutes sitting on beanbags in your faculty offices and having wine and cheese. And look, it was a great time to be a student. And I learned a lot. Learned a lot about myself as well as the subject matter. And I really encountered at Wollongong at that time a lot of kindness amongst teachers and understanding of life. And I think that was part of probably the genesis of Wollongong University, university born of steel. So, work was not a foreign concept. Not like in many other universities where students go straight from school. And also, I often look back and I think at the time, probably there were a lot of disaffected people from Sydney who'd come to teach at Wollongong. So we had some pretty amazing teachers. So it was a great place to be a student.
And the sort of learning experiences that you had, apart from the beanbags and the and the
well,
wine?
Really, it was, look, as you know, the life of a part-time student, which is probably my student experience, is probably the normal for most students now. Which is one of the differences, say, coming from the US. Even though university education is very expensive, many students get living expenses bundled into their student loan. So we talk a lot about HECS and all the other fee enabling strategies, but they don't pay people to live. And so it's very different. Look, it's juggling multiple priorities. It's and probably just sort of having less time for you, to be honest. But I think there are multiple pathways. One of the great things that opportunities I had in the US was I went to this big sort of doctoral conference. And, in many of the Ivy League schools, your destiny. And so I had great pleasure of getting up and saying, look, I'm Trish Davidson. I'm a diploma nurse. I studied part-time, did my PhD part-time. I didn't do a postdoc, and I'm the Dean of Johns Hopkins School of Nursing. So I think, part of it is for students, as you probably know, there are a lot of expectations, a lot of scripted narratives for people's career journeys, but really you can do it all in different ways.
Yeah, look, one of my spies tell me that you walk around campus, you talk to students, you remember staff, the names of staff, and that's something that they really value. So when you're walking around talking to students, what sort of stories are you hearing from them?
Look, firstly, after they get over the fact, oh, there's this crazy old lady talking to me, I think they're enjoying, for the current students, enjoying being back on campus. I think this particularly, I notice for our current people early in their student career, there's a lot of challenges and a lot of kind of gaps that people have experienced during COVID.
Mm-hmm.
But, they're all often just great to be here. And, I have such a great, I just love being with students and staff. And, I'm just sort of a bit over this narrative of ChatGPT and whatever. It kind of assumes that everybody is up to some nefarious act. And as I said to my team yesterday, look, 97% of our students, which is probably 98, 99%, you are going to behave ethically. And there's always going to be a percentage, and they have been there since, Adam and Eve. But, I really hope that we move to a more student-centered dialogue. That would be one of the things that I like. So I think that's why we're here. They give me energy and enthusiasm, and it's, they motivate and inspire me that the world is going to be in a good place.
So what would that student-centered dialogue look like? And, a much more, look, I'm on the same page as you. I think that it is about learning rather than teaching. It's about students rather than necessarily getting jobs. So what would it look like for you?
Well, firstly, I think we've got to dismantle the hierarchy of education. And I've kind of seen a similar journey in healthcare where it was very hierarchical, and it's moved to more being patient and person-centered. Judyth, I did my MED in the, 80s, and we talked about student-centered learning, but it's never been student-centered because it's all been about, narrow options, timetables, not full disclosure, and a kind of an us and them.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that we've done at University of Wollongong, and and kudos to my colleagues because this was in train before I got here, is that we've actually signed a kind of a declaration of students as partners, and we really try and engage the student body meaningfully. It's a work in progress, but we have a student advisory council and it meets once a month, and all the executive go, and it can be a very frank conversation. That group have been so incredibly helpful in understanding the student experience, particularly during COVID. So that's great. And I just think, they're adults. Treating adults is a kind of a good start. But I still am dismayed at the us and them that I sometimes hear, like this whole, ChatGPT. It's just the assumption is students are going to cheat. Well, can I tell you, I think and one of the things that I would like us to talk to more about is the ethical aspects, and probably in modern big class Australian undergraduate courses, we don't have that unscripted time for dialogue. So, that was one of the things being at Hopkins in a very boutique niche environment. If there was an issue, I'd kind of do the mother matron chat where I'd say to them, look, the most precious thing you have is your integrity. You're great. No one's going to know your grade point average, but if you misbehave or people find you untrustworthy, that will be with you forever. So I think we have to have more of that dialogue.
Mhm.
The other thing is, where do we, how do we take pressure off students?
Mhm.
I think that's really important. I did a lot of work when I was at Hopkins of really understanding when students do cheat. And it's generally when they're under extraordinary pressure for other things.
Mhm. Mhm.
And there's a whole literature on that. And particularly in nursing, I would try and transfer that to saying, look, when you are sleep deprived, when you're anxious, you're not going to make good decisions. And so I would like to change that narrative about from beyond technology is bad to how do we use technology, and also how do we fundamentally respect students. Don't go into, those invigilated exams just do my head in.
Mhm.
If I could, but it's been with all of this discussion of AI, people returning to pen and paper exams. I actually had a conversation with my team last week. I said, okay, so who's going to grade all of these exams? Let's just think about it. And also, I think students will be disadvantaged. I wouldn't like to write more than 1 or 2 pages freehand anymore. I just, just not geared up to that.
Mhm.
So I think just more respectful dialogue is important. And I've sort of found our students here and just my interactions with students really value that.
Mhm. Look, you mentioned and you brought up the different experience that American students had. And part of it is the on-campus living, that residential living. So there's, the campus is stickier. What other differences do you see between East Coast students and, say, East Coast Australian students as represented by Wollongong?
Well, look, firstly, all of the health schools at Hopkins are graduate schools. So no, there was no residence. So
Right.
but it's really interesting. I've got very mixed views about the on-campus living. To me, this is my personal view, is that sometimes you create a substrate for young people where bad things are going to happen because they don't have the experience to deal with the complexity of alcohol, sex, all of those things. So, and I also wonder how long it defers the growing up to be. And so in terms of the students, pardon me, I see them as being very similar. Hopkins is not even though it's, a very high ranking university. If you've ever been to Baltimore, it's in a very, socioeconomically challenging community. So you can't get above your station in Hopkins. So, but what is the amazing thing there is that people would come from all around the world, not for the basketball courts or the football, they came to do the work. But, I see the students as being, very similar. One of the things that I think is universal that I spend a lot of time thinking about and worrying about is mental health of our students. I see that concerns me, that young people are under so much pressure and duress and feelings that's a worry. So I kind of feel like at university, if you can make things easier, if you can create more sense of control for students, it's got to be better for everybody.
And help them to be successful. That sense of support, success and belonging.
Yeah. And that's one of I've not always made myself popular, but that's one of the great things about being in leadership is you can overturn decisions, you can overturn dismissals, because, often in organizations, people have these very tight policy.
Mm-hmm.
But, if someone's been struggling, it's always great to be able to give them another chance. And I have some really great examples of people who, in my mind, of where that was the right thing to do. And it could be from cheating. Like, we've got to be able to come back from, everybody makes mistakes. No one is perfect. And, this is a very formative time in people's lives. So that doesn't mean that people, certainly there's serious acts where people are dismissed, but there's a big continuum from us plagiarizing to, sexual assault.
Mm-hmm.
They're very, so I think, I think being compassionate and understanding and just trying to understand people's experiences, I think is real.
So I'm hearing that integrity is at the core of what drives you as an educator. What else drives you as an educator that you've brought from your own experience and you're bringing to a leadership position at Wollongong?
So, I'm a great believer of excellence without elitism.
Mm-hmm.
I think always striving to do better is what I do for myself. And I'm sure that I drive people crazy that I work with, because I like change. I'm always developing and evolving. Maybe not always for the better, but I like moving forward. I like change. And I like always thinking that we could do better, think better, innovate.
Mm-hmm.
So I've seen that throughout my career. And, one of the best things, actually, this student, it's quite ironic. This person now, when I think about it, has now come to work here at Wollongong. But I like the fact that students can be, comfortable, because they're like, this must be 20 years ago, maybe
Mm-hmm.
more. Phone. He said, I was meeting him at, he was a PhD student, and I said something about, he said, oh, I'll SMS you. And I didn't know what an SMS. He said, he didn't say, look, no, next time I'll call you. He wasn't deferential, like, next time I'll call you. He said, I'll show you how to do it. And so I think the best lessons in life I've learned from patients as being a nurse, and also from students.
Mm-hmm.
They teach you and help you to be a better person.
They also do teach you not to take things for granted, don't they?
Well,
you can't assume certain things about their background anymore.
No. And that's one of the things that I love, is particularly at university, is the cultural diversity and that we have in the world. And that's what you get in universities, which is wonderful.
And a community like Wollongong is sort of complex, but also aspirational.
Very aspirational. I feel really comfortable here because it's kind of pretty egalitarian. It's a bit like Johns Hopkins. You can't get above your station to you. Someone will pull you down. But and yet there is just some amazing work happening here. And people are much more understated. So no, there's some great work happening here.
So if you could change something for students now in your role as Vice Chancellor, she who has the purse strings and she who has the influence and positional authority, what would you do?
I would like to create more flexibility for them to negotiate. I would like to change the culture so it was not so punitive, us and them. I have never deducted a mark in my life for anything being late, because I think that's my style. I just think we have all of these perverse rules, and I know we need some boundaries, but imagine if you had and again, it's harder in these big, these class sizes are huge. So in the ideal world, that you would be able to negotiate a learning contract and be able to do that. I'd like to ban exams. Could I say that?
Yes.
I'd like to ban exams.
But how do you know that students have learnt something?
Well, I think there's a whole range of different assessment techniques, and one of the best assessment techniques is peer assessment. So I think, there's different ways of learning, from, short answers, essays, Vivas, whatever. But some people love exams. Like, I've just done the company directors course and I think, oh my gosh, I've got to do another exam. Well, I don't have to. But, to me, I think that's, it's a very shallow summative assessment. And I don't think that it actually translates to being able to assess competencies. So I think, rather than knowledge recall, I think it's moving to more competency-based assessments. But because we know knowing how to do something doesn't mean you're going to do it. But, I also understand the pragmatics and the reality of things. But I think in principle, we over-assess generally. And I think that comes back to trust. As a teacher, if you can create a dynamic where there's reciprocity and trust, it's just that they're going to do the right thing, not because people are watching you. So, and this is something that, as particularly being an educator in nursing, we don't want to, as nurse teachers, be creating an environment where people are only going to perform well if they're being watched. I think one of the greatest things that many nurses talk about is, if that was your mother, your brother, your sister, your husband, how would you want them to be treated? And I think that speaks more to values and culture.
So then what are the other values? So you've talked about integrity, you've talked about fairness and equity. Any others that are really at the core of Patricia Davidson as a leader?
I don't know. Look, I think striving for excellence, so I think being aspirational for a better world and a better self and a better life are really important. I think honesty, trust, they're things that are all very important to me. And, one of the things that I really love is the team. And I don't know how you translate that to values, but I always loved in nursing working in areas which have been my sort of specialties in heart failure and cardiology, where it's all about the team. Where there's nurses, physicians, pharmacists, physiotherapists. And I still struggle here in the universities where it's a team. And in fact, I was just having a conversation with one of the people you mentioned before. I said, why doesn't someone just pick up the phone and call you? And they said, to pick up the phone and call the Vice Chancellor is a big deal. So one of the things, I've always found is anybody can call me. And I actually learned this as a clinician. People respect that. I was on, remember firstly when I sort of established a lot of the home-based heart failure programs, and the cardiologists would say, don't give me a number, they call you all your time. And I actually looked at the data and, over a kind of probably 5-year period, there was a handful of calls that were not appropriate. Most people respect. And it's the same, I learned this in the US from an intensivist who put his mobile number on everybody's bedboard, you know, the name.
Mm-hmm.
He said, if you're worried, call me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would really like to sort of break down a lot of the authority in universities so that we were more collaborative and collegial with each other, and also with our students. But that means being prepared to have challenging conversations. That's the other thing is, and actually there's actually a scholarship in nursing called the tyranny of niceness. So, you know, people are in meetings, smile, yes, and then they go out the door and, you know, say, what was she thinking? And she, you know, so sometimes I know I can say, you know, not direct, but, you know, I think we need to be able to have those crucial conversations.
Mm-hmm. So last question. Well, in fact, it's two. What advice would you give to the young Patricia in terms of re-navigating her life? And then what advice would you give to a young student who had aspirations in the academy?
Look, I think there's two things. One is keep your eye on the prize. The other thing is that I'm realistic about what it takes. And I learned this from one of my mentors, Kathy Draker, and who was a sort of on my committee for my PhD, and she was the Dean of Nursing at UCSF. And I always remember when I finished and I got my first academic job, she said, Trish, you are so lucky. She said, this is the best job in the world. You get to, you know, teach amazing young people. You travel the world. You have phenomenal colleagues, and you can work any 80 hours of the week you choose. So I say that because, you know, you don't get to where, you know, I'm at doing a 35-hour week. Mm-hmm. I think that's part of the myth. You know, we try and tell people, say no. You know, I sit through all of these things, you know, many of these workshops with junior faculty, and I think that's not what I would be saying to them. You know, saying no can close doors. Negotiation is good. Look, I'm not sure if I could do it, but let me see how I can help you find someone to do it. That's what I would say. So you've got to work really hard. And I think if you're a woman, you've got to work probably even harder. Mm-hmm. And having said that, you know, and what I often say to young in particular, I mean, more often I get, say at Hopkins, we did a Women in Leadership. They say, what would advice would be, you know, be kinder and gentler to your younger self. And you can have everything, but not necessarily at the one time. So now as I get to the end of my career, I haven't had a linear trajectory. I've had fits and starts, but I've had the joy of being a mother. And now I have the even greater joy of being a grandmother. But I look at some of my other colleagues and, you know, to be honest, I would get frustrated earlier on because I didn't have the same ability, but you get there. Mm-hmm. But the other really big thing that I think we need to change in the academy is just making sure that people feel comfortable in the roles they're in and not begrudge other people. You know, I always think in my previous role as the dean at Hopkins, and there was only 2 people in the whole school without a PhD, and they taught the clinical classes, but they were the best faculty members. They loved the students, they loved the work, they loved their colleagues, but they didn't begrudge anybody else anything. They were happy in their own self, their own skin, and took pride in their work. Whereas there are other people that were frustrated and competitive. So I think finding a place where you feel supported, valued, and enabled in universities is really important. I think we need to value teaching more. Everybody, at Hopkins, everybody taught, including the president. I try and teach the odd class here, and I've got doctoral students, because we've got a role model work. Because, even in my previous role, I'd interview new faculty and they say, do I have to teach? And I'd say, well, when I walked in the door this morning, it did say School of Nursing on the front, the door. So I think, yes, teaching is part of it. So I think getting to a place, I'm really excited as teaching and learning kind of becomes more embedded in the infrastructure of universities. I think that's really exciting. And it's not an either or, but I think if you value teaching and you value students, you're going to be a good teacher.
I think you're right. And what a great place for us to end. Trish, thanks for giving me half an hour. In fact, it's 40 minutes of your day today.
Oh, well, it's been a pleasure to speak with you.
Visit studiosity.com/Students First for the next Students First Symposium, an open forum for faculty, staff and academics to candidly discuss and progress the issues that matter most in higher education.